So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Illinois Tech Social Sciences Great Problem, Great Minds Seminar Series. For today's seminar, you can submit questions during the webinar by typing in the chat box. We will open the floor to questions at the end of the webinar. Today's speaker is Professor Natasha Iskander. Dr. Natasha Iskander is an associate professor of urban planning and public service, conducts research on the relationship between migration and economic development. She looks at the ways that immigration and the movement of people across borders can provide the basis for the creation of new knowledge and of new pathways for political change. She has published widely on these questions, looking specifically at immigration skill, economic development, and worker rights, with more than 30 articles in the book chapters on these topics. Her first book, Creative State, 14 Years of Migration and Development Policy in Morocco and Mexico, looked at the ways that migrant workers transformed the economic development policies of their countries of origin. Her recent book, The Skill Make Us Human, migrant workers in 20th century Qatar and beyond, examines the use of skill categories to define political personhood in ways that have become increasingly salient with the hardening borders and the presence of climate change. Dr. Iskander's research has been supported by grants from the NSF, the Sloan Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation, and the Social Science Research Council, and the Qatar National Research Foundation, and others. She has held positions as a fellow in residence at the Zomberg Institute for Migration and Mobility at the New School for Social Research, at the Center for Advanced Studies of the Behavior Sciences at Stanford University, and at the Global Research Institute at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. Iskander received her PhD in MIT in management at MIT. She also holds a master's in city planning from MIT and a bachelor degree in cultural studies from Stanford University. In addition to her research, she engages in development work with partners ranging from the World Bank to small non-government organizations internationally and in the United States on issues of urban development, migration, and the development policies and migrant worker writers. So it's very delightful to welcome Professor Natasha Iskander to talk about her recent book.
Thank you so much for having me. What a wonderful privilege to be able to participate in this great series. Today, I want to spend, as Hao suggested, a little bit of time giving you a very quick overview of my most recent book. The book is called Does Skill Make Us Human? And it asks, is skill another word for freedom? It asks, what are the political consequences of defining some people as skilled and some people as unskilled? And the book explores these questions by looking at the experience of migrant workers in Qatar's booming construction industry in the lead up to the 2022 World Cup. I started this project shortly after Qatar was awarded the 2022 FIFA World Cup for soccer hosting rights in 2010. The games will be held in November, so for all of you who are soccer fans, you should keep an eye on this space. After it was awarded the hosting rights, Qatar began the massive construction required for the games almost immediately, funneling hundreds of billions of dollars to reinvent itself as a global destination for sports and culture. To illustrate how dramatic this transformation has been, allow me to show you a picture from the period in which Qatar was preparing its World Cup bid, so 2 years before it was awarded the hosting rights. You can see here that the coastline is still pretty bare. I just want to draw your attention here to the Sheraton Pyramid and also to the Hurricane Building here. Here you can see the same shoreline as in the previous slide, anchored by the Hurricane Building and the Sheraton Pyramid. It's taken just a short decade later. This is the transformation in 10 years. You can see how dramatic the transformation has been. The shoreline here is a jostle of iconic building next to iconic building, each designed by a different star architect. So in the interlude between these two photos, the city more than tripled its footprint. It upgraded its infrastructure. It put in an integrated rail project that's the largest civil engineering project in the world. It built a new port, a new airport, a new naval base, a new economic zone, and the largest greenfield smart city in the world. The buildings that have received the most attention over the past few months are the 8 stadia that Qatar has built for the World Cup. These are 6 of them. Each of these stadia represents an amazing design achievement. They have distinguished accomplishments in sustainable design, and modular construction, and geothermal cooling systems, and many other innovations in building. But the stadia represent a tiny fraction of the development over the past decade. They represent about $4 billion out of close to 300 billion. The massive development that Qatar undertook expanded outward into the bay. This is the Pearl Qatar in Doha. It's an artificial island that spans nearly 4 square kilometers, and it's the largest luxury mixed-use development in the Middle East. A few kilometers north of Doha, the old Doha city, Lusail city extends outward into the sea on 4 man-made islands of a total of 40 kilometers squared. This massive development has been funded through hydrocarbon revenues, and Qatar has also upgraded its liquefied natural gas facilities to protect these hydrocarbon revenues, which are likely to keep growing and expanding given the geopolitical situation at the moment between Russia and Ukraine. This is the Barzan LNG processing plant. But Qatar has also invested in the construction of 6 new underground wells, along with associated bridges, pipes, and subsea manifolds. And this was an investment of about 50 billion. As part of this massive development, Qatar built a number of stunning cultural and educational buildings. This is the Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies. It's on the edge of Education City, which is a complex of overseas campuses with Carnegie Mellon, Georgetown, Northwestern, and others. And the QFIS building, the building you see here, contains a faculty and a mosque. It is a 3-dimensional representation of Islamic calligraphy. The design of the building is meant to capture the relationship between knowledge and faith, which is a very important tenet in Islam. And it was designed by the Spanish architects Manguera Ivares. The mosque space is illuminated with hundreds of tiny lights, which are meant to evoke the brilliance of the stars on desert nights. There are gardens of paradise throughout the building with internal waterfalls. verses of the Quran are also displayed throughout the building in diverse styles of Islamic calligraphy reflecting different historical periods. They are embossed on the cladding, as you see here, and often also in stainless steel configurations. The building was a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle fitted with pieces fitted together with joints so that the building could actually move in response to the desert winds. And the minarets here were designed to look like beams of light, and they rose 80 meters above the ground, but were cantilevered at a 25-degree incline. And there are hydraulic devices at the base of these minarets that allow the beams to sway in the high desert winds. Technically, the building was extremely complex. It's a highly sophisticated engineering design. Like many of the buildings in Qatar, it actually represented an unprecedented feat of engineering and design. And here you can see that the building is designed around steel rib cages, which allow the building to actually move in response to the environment. As you can imagine, the building was extremely difficult to build with lots of precision work. The cladding, for example, which had to allow the building to move, but also had to line up the calligraphy, the alignment of each cladding piece had to be perfect. Here, I just want to, for the purposes of this talk, just focus a little bit on the scaffolding to construct this building, to allow the cladding to be put in place. The building had to be surrounded by a scaffolding shell to accommodate this detail installation and welding work. But the most difficult technical challenge was the construction of the scaffolds for the minarets. These were freestanding scaffolds of 85 meters high, which is 26 stories. This is the largest and most elaborate scaffolding structure ever attempted anywhere in the world. The scaffolding is a living structure. It goes up, it goes down, it gets moved. And to do this scaffolding work, hundreds of workers hauled up the material to build this structure manually, up dozens of stairs, up ladders, up temporary stairs that were then deconstructed. They hauled up pipes and joints and planks and swivels, gravelocks and clamps. What this meant was that every worker handled 1 ton of material every day. They handled this material with precision, and they had to handle it wordlessly, passing this material hand to hand without speaking, because the environment around them was very, very loud with construction sounds and wind. So they assembled and interpreted this scaffold, and they adjusted construction documents to meet the changing needs of the building. They also built an internal structure. This is on the inside of the building. And here I want to draw your attention to the fact that this is a floating scaffold built from the outside in. And underneath this scaffolding here, there is only air. This is several stories up in the air. And here I just want to draw your attention to this floating scaffold element. What this looks like when workers are on those scaffolding elements is this. And the workers who worked on this scaffolding structure called themselves the people who hang from the sky, because they would literally hang from these scaffolding structures with nothing underneath them, like 15, 20 stories up in the air. And this scaffolding structure, the construction of it, led to not a single fall, not a single injury from falling equipment, and not one failure. I mean, it was a remarkable achievement. The men who hung from the sky were recruited from all over the world. The QFIS site, like most large sites, was about 10,000 men who spoke over 20 languages on site. I mean, together, the site included 20 languages. The construction industry in Qatar is 100% migrant, just to give you a sense of what this looks like. If you look at the economically active population in Qatar by nationality and by industry, you can see here that the construction industry represents a significant portion of the labor market, and it has no Qatari participation here. This yellow line that's meant to indicate Qatari participation, national participation in the construction industry is not drawn to scale. If it were drawn to scale, it would probably be invisible. Out of close to 1 million workers, less than 2,000 were Qatari. But the migrants recruited from all over the world to build Qatar, to reinvent it, arrived with minimal construction experience, if any. What this meant was that companies on these construction sites had to invest heavily in training their workforces. They had to train workforces to build the kind of unprecedented structures that I showed you in the previous slides. Every aspect of every building process on the project site was designed to promote on-the-job learning. They were trying to build something, the companies were trying to build something that even the engineers on site were not sure that they were going to be able to pull off. So they were not just training an existing skill, they were actually training a new skill that was being developed on these sites. And what this meant was that construction sites in Qatar functioned as vast training systems through which thousands of men developed specialized construction skill. Companies designed highly detailed and proprietary systems to measure and develop worker skill, measuring their skill often several times a day to see how the learning process was progressing, because these companies utterly depended on this skill to produce the kind of buildings I have just showed you. In other words, companies lived and died based on how well they were able to train their workforces. But when I asked the managers and supervisors at projects like QFIS about their workers, they all described them as unskilled. They described their master scaffolders, these scaffolders who built these amazing buildings, their expert welders and their precision cladders as unproductive, poor quality, and sometimes just as bodies. This was, by the way, a view implicitly and unintentionally reinforced by the press coverage and human rights analysis of Qatar. While these reports documented an array of labor abuses, including wage theft, abysmal living conditions, forced overtime, injury and death, they focused their attention on violations of basic bodily welfare. They focused on the bodies of workers, the exploitation that they experienced on and through the body, representing them or not representing actually their enormous capacity and their enormous skill. Much of the coverage in these reports attributed the extreme, my light is going to go off here in a second. Okay, here we go. Much of the coverage attributed the extreme labor violations observed to the legal framework in Qatar, which was called the kafala or sponsorship system. This framework formally bound all migrant workers to their employers, but all foreign workers in Qatar were covered by the same rules. And let me remind you that 95% of the labor force in Qatar was migrant, everyone from the laborer on the construction site to the CEO. And they were all covered by the same kafala framework, regardless of wage, occupation, or national origin. But certainly professionals, doctors, executives, hotel managers, were not experiencing the same kind of labor violations as construction workers. So what was producing the extreme exploitation that construction workers faced? To understand what was producing working conditions in Qatar, alongside the absolutely critical role that workers were playing in the construction industry. Why were they experiencing abuse if they were so critical to the country's future? I conducted research in 5 countries in 8 languages. I interviewed a broad array of actors, from government to industry leaders to workers, and I spent hundreds of hours on Qatari construction sites, shadowing workers. I did the research in layers. I started with an institutional analysis of the construction industry in Qatar to understand how work and production was organized. Then I moved on to conducting participant observation on a number of construction sites to get a better understanding of skill politics as they were developed at work. Then, to understand the full cycle of migration to recruitment, a full cycle of migration from recruitment to employment to return. I did fieldwork in 3 migrant source countries, Nepal, Philippines, and India, along with some comparative research in Singapore. And then I did a historical analysis to understand the regulatory frameworks and their origins that were structuring the construction industry and labor. Through this research, it became clear to me that skill meant something other than ability. Managers and supervisors were not referring to ability. They were talking about a political category. Unskilled was a subordinate political status. The migrants who were described as unskilled and slotted into that category were dehumanized. And they were described also as not having the full capacity for freedom. And so their exploitation was made to seem inconsequential and unavoidable. The reason that this was possible, and the reason that skill is important in this politics, is that in denying skill, employers were in effect denying learning. In calling their workers unskilled, they were denying that their workers had engaged in the process of learning. And if you reflect on it, and certainly those of us who are teachers in some capacity understand that learning is fundamentally an act of freedom. You can compel someone to do something, but you cannot force them to learn. Learning is an intimate process. It requires imagination, connection, trust, desire. It requires volition. It is an expression of agency. So in denying learning, companies were denying that workers had the capacity for these registers of human experience, the imagination, the trust, the desire, the agency. They were denying their capacity for freedom. And from the management perspective, how could you possibly deny workers something that they didn't have to begin with? How could you deny them rights and dignity that they didn't have to start out with? So the argument I'm making about skill is not about bias and assessment, but it is rather about the political consequences of being unskilled. It's not about whether companies were calling workers who were skilled unskilled and mistaking or mismeasuring their skill. That's not the argument that I'm making. But I am saying that workers who were described as unskilled, whether or not they were skilled, some workers certainly were unskilled and were at the very beginning process of becoming skilled. It's that when they were labeled unskilled, that was used as a political tool to cast doubt on the full political personhood of workers and to call into question their capacity for and therefore their right to freedom. I want to also point out here, and I'll get into this a little bit more in just a second, that freedom of workers who were described as unskilled was limited in direct and tangible ways. Because their skill was embodied, in other words, their skill was held in their bodies, it was often tacit, difficult to describe. The only way to control and deny their skill was to surveil and control their bodies. And workers endured control and surveillance on site in ways that were numerous and degrading. Okay. As I began examining skill as a measure, not as a measure of ability, but rather as a political category, it became clear to me that these politics of skill shaped all aspects of social and political life in Qatar. And the book goes through each of these facets one by one, from law to urban planning to heat injury and climate change. And then finally, in the conclusion, I point to the ways that the politics of skill, which are so visible in Qatar, also structure many other national and transnational contexts, including in the US. I look at the ways that skill politics increasingly shape immigration policy, especially in the shift toward restrictive, merit-based, in quotations, approaches to migration. Okay, so in reflecting on Qatar, one of the very interesting things is that the regulatory structure in Qatar has changed dramatically since I did the research, while I was doing the research, and since. And that this conversation about Qatar is really a global conversation. So it's not just that the politics of skill apply beyond Qatar. It is also that the conversation about Qatar is also about skill more broadly and the politics of skill more broadly. In Qatar, many actors have gotten involved, as I mentioned, human rights organizations, the international press, but also union groups, sporting groups, and the international companies themselves participating in the construction, along with the governments of the migrants who are working in Qatar, have gotten involved. And Qatar issued a series of reforms. Just to go over these very quickly, they now have a minimum wage, workers have the ability to change jobs, and workers can exit the country at will. These regulatory changes are significant and they represent a real unwinding of the kafala system. And so the regulatory structures that bound workers to their employers don't bind them in the same way. But these regulatory changes have not affected the political use of skill. The political use of skill continues to shape workplace conditions and all aspects of social and economic life in Qatar. So now, even as Qatar is creating this new vision through urban development and thinking about who will belong to that new vision, it has also been using political definitions of skill to define who it will exclude, who it will omit from the future that it is creating. And so here, this vision and skill division is manifested very clearly in the urban and spatial distribution of the city. Since 2005, Qatar has banned by law workers it classifies as unskilled, and here again, regardless of their ability, from the city that they themselves have built. Workers are required to live in this gray area called the industrial area. And so the government has published these color-coded maps indicating which area of the city unskilled workers are prohibited from residing in, and in practice from circulating in. So these yellow areas are called family areas, and unskilled workers are prohibited from living and circulating in them. These distinctions are enforced by police, but also by private security. And the penalties are not just a heavy fine, but often detention and deportation. So in contrast to the very glittering Doha, which I showed you just a few slides ago, you can see here that the industrial area is very grim. It's in an area where workers live, but that is actually zoned for industrial use, with cement factories, chemical plants, construction material storage, equipment parking, and labor camps. So you can see here that this gray expanse looks very different than the glittering center of town. The conditions in these camps, as I mentioned before, are well documented by the international press and human rights organizations, and they are pretty grim: overcrowded, unsanitary, degrading, and unsafe. In response to complaints by many advocacy organizations, Qatar has tried to upgrade housing for its quote unquote unskilled workers. And it has created, it has built an area called Labor City in the industrial area. So this Labor City has upgraded living accommodations. So instead of 12 or 16 men on bunk beds in a small room, they are now limited to 4 to a room. Some of the facilities even have gym and entertainment facilities, kitchens and bathrooms that are modern and clean. They are, in some sense, upgraded exclusion. Excuse me. These barracks now provide housing for 100,000 workers, and the upgrade comes with a security upgrade as well. These structures are monitored by security guards, and no unsanctioned exit or entry is permitted. So the kinds of photos and access that I was able to secure myself in my research would be impossible here, as are kind of reports by human rights organizations and advocacy organizations. So you can't enter unless the security services allow you to enter. The barracks are outfitted with CCTV cameras. Workers report phone and internet monitoring, and they are geolocated through their phones or through motion bracelets. So here, I think it's important to think through what this kind of exclusion means. So Qatar has been using this intensive development to define itself as a global destination, as I mentioned, for sports and culture, as a playground for the elites, as a knowledge economy. It is representing a future for itself. And the workers who are building this future, who are not just building it through their effort, but through their knowledge, their skill, their imagination, their volition, their agency, have no place in the future that Qatar is designing for itself. They are part of a past in this national definition, in the face of this particular future that Qatar is defining for itself. Qatar does not view them as having any place in the trajectory, the national trajectory that it's defining for themselves, any more than living in a segregated way in barracks that are surveilled and monitored and that don't allow them to participate in the life of the city spaces they are building. The question here, as we face growing inequality and as the rhetoric of skill enters into our narratives around space, migration, economic development, growth, futures, is to consider whether Qatar is the kind of future that many cities are building, many cities are envisioning for themselves. And the answer to that question, empirically, but also speculatively, as in, will we make Qatar our future? Will we design cities that are exclusionary? To answer that question, we need to look at who builds the city and under what conditions. And most importantly, we have to think about what are the social narratives that are enacted in the conditions, designs, and futures being created. What are the power dynamics and inequality these narratives, and here I've highlighted the narrative of skill. What are the power dynamics and inequalities that they produce? Exclusions are always designed and constructed. And in Qatar, the narrative of skill has taken center stage in a way that allows us to see it more clearly, but it plays out in many other contexts as well. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank Professor Natasha Iskander for very insightful presentation about these skills and politics in Qatar. And also I think not only just provide the empirical studies, I feel is also provide the theoretical framework to redefine the skills in the economic fields in the urban planning. So currently we open to the questions. If any questions. So I think my first question is about the standing countries. So did you see like the standing countries, there's any difference when they have what these migrant works in Qatar for these skills and unskilled categories?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some kind of marking of the category of skill onto national origin. So, and some racial categorization also. So, for example, workers from Europe, the UK, from Australia, from the US were described as skilled, regardless of whether or not they were actually skilled, or if they were skilled in the same kinds of skill that were routinely denied, like master scaffolders, for example, from the UK, were described as skilled even, and the workers who they were working alongside of, who were from other countries, who were just as skilled, were described as unskilled. So if they were working alongside an Indian master scaffolder, that Indian master scaffolder was often described as unskilled.
Okay. So which means that their standing countries do play a role to define these skill categories.
I mean, the sending countries themselves played not so much of a role, but certainly the rhetoric in Qatar defined people based on some level by national origin as skilled or unskilled.
Oh yeah. I didn't mean the standing country. Definitely, yeah. So the other question is like for how did you see like this the skill and unskill related to the specialization? So and since it seems your field work is more about like construction industrials, so how do you see actually these related to these skill categories?
So, you know, Qatar is interesting because the construction industry in Qatar represents about 50% of the labor market, which is extremely high, right? In most economies, that's like 3 to 5%. So this is like an economy that was all about the overhaul, the reinvention through construction of itself. And so the kind of political rhetorics that manifested in construction were really powerful. I mean, it's half the labor market. And so the distinction between unskilled and skilled that was developed there played out in other contexts as well. So the industrial area, for example, housed not just construction workers, but housed maintenance workers, other kinds of workers who were not involved directly in the construction industry. There was also a gender component here. So the workers who were defined as unskilled were male, and women were by default not defined as unskilled because it wasn't anything that had to do with skill. So women in the service sector, for example, were not defined as unskilled.
That's very interesting. What's the reason?
Because of housing, right? So these industrial areas were not. This industrial area was not a mixed setting. This was a city of 500,000 men. So the idea that women would live there is like it's.
I see. So it's kind of try to balance this like a gender ratio for the studies. So yeah, that's very actually is a little surprised to know actually for the Qatar's construction industry actually is more than 15%. It's because this is the highly industrialized process of Qatar for their economies. So that's the reason they are actually the construction industry has a high.
Yeah, I mean, Qatar is trying to invent itself through construction. So it's trying to make itself into a global destination through construction, and it doesn't. You know, the revenues for this industry come from hydrocarbons, so it doesn't actually have any other activity really besides construction and oil right now, oil and gas. And so in a way, it's trying to invent an economy through construction.
I see. It's kind of Earth engine.
Yes.
Servers engine. I see. So another question is like it seems for these skilled or unskilled, especially for unskilled, so then it's kind of in the no value of this labor supply chain. So it have any like international law will be involved in like protect like the label's benefit or rights, worker rights for this, or actually for the local organization or already have this kind of organizations.
So you're asking me whether or not there are organizations in Qatar that defend worker rights, is that correct? No, is the short answer. The organizations involved in creating worker reforms to protect workers are international organizations. They are international advocacy organizations. And most recently, the most, I think, influential organization is the International Labor Organization that has worked with Qatar to amend its regulatory structures. But, you know, I think the reason that international organizations have gotten involved is that Qatar is going to be hosting the World Cup. So it has attracted international attention. The working conditions in Qatar are not worse and possibly better than the working conditions, for example, in Saudi Arabia. But the working conditions in Saudi Arabia have not received any kind of attention along the lines of the conditions in Qatar, because Saudi is not hosting an international event. I mean, it hosts the Hajj every year, but that's somewhat different.
I see. So, which means for this organization actually is international, is more international organization involves instead of like a local organization involves. So So then, did you see the feature in the future that's possible, like for the local organization involved, since actually this industrials, construction industrials actually is a large part of economy.
Well, I don't know that it will be a large part of the economy forever. I think that is having this kind of big development push now, and then it will eventually end. And, Qatar is planning for that eventuality. So it's built, housing for 100,000 workers in the construction industry and other industries. I don't foresee that it will build much more, because I think it plans on sending most of the construction workers back home.
Okay, so which means that actually this is more like a temporal level
Yes.
force in the Qatar.
Yes.
I see. So then how did you see actually for this skill, actually this define like a skill and the unskill, they are more, they are like a personhood for this instead of actually for the political this political use.
So I'm not sure I understand the question. You're asking me how it was developed, this.
So which means that it seems that these skills is a lot of times the people actually they have the skills is it's not by trade. It's actually they naturally have certain skills by like life experience or by their personal natural gift. So then how actually this will be a factor this the political use for these defined skills.
So, this political category, it doesn't actually have much to do with skill at all. Right? Like in some sense, right, it's a political category to justify exploitation. It's not a political category that refers to the actual ability of people. So, a worker might be very skilled and described as unskilled. A worker might be, a master at his trade and be described as unskilled. In the same way that, an unskilled woman would never be described as unskilled. And it has nothing to do with whether or not she's unskilled. It has to do with the gender valence of the category of unskilled in Qatar. So I think that is, in a way, Qatar helps us see the political use of skill kind of more broadly, right? Like we tend to take skill categories literally. We assume that they are a measurement, a technical measurement of skill, technical measurement of ability. But they have a political side to them. And in Qatar, that political side is very, very obvious. I mean, it's mapped out onto their urban planning. There's a policy dictated segregation by skill categories, right? Like, so it's very obvious there, but it helps us think about the ways in which skill categories in other contexts also have a political dimension. My work on construction workers in the US shows much the same thing, so that workers who are Latino are often described as unskilled, even though they may be actually quite highly skilled. And so, right, like, what does it mean to have this kind of political side to a category that passes as technical? In other words, can we use a more critical lens in thinking about what we mean by skill, and look at it not, take it not literally, like actually examine it critically to see the ways in which this category is structuring social hierarchies, is structuring racial understandings, is structuring gender norms, how is that category working? And that doesn't mean that skill doesn't exist, right? So clearly some people are very skilled, some people are not skilled, and most of us are somewhere in between on a variety of different, in a variety of different capacities. But there's a political charge to unskilled that I think we need to pay more attention to.
So when you say this political charge, so do you also mean their potential development of their future skills, even if, for example, they are very skilled but defined unskilled. So it's possible they kind of have opportunities to develop their skills to become like a skilled category, or it's actually the political charge is put them like permanently in that category.
I think that there is something to the permanence, but I think the more important thing is the implication of it, right? Like if you describe someone who is skilled as unskilled, you are, as a capitalist, say, you can take their skill and not compensate it, right? That's the measurement piece. But the political piece is not only can you take their skill without paying for it, but you can restrict their freedom, subject them to degrading conditions, and there's no pushback, right? Like there's no real challenge to that idea. It becomes more politically possible to subject people who are described as unskilled to police action, to segregation, to a whole host of exploitative social conditions.
So, which means what you are finding is actually no matter how their skills level, actually their social or economic aspects actually doesn't change much by their skills level themselves. Is more already kind of embedded in these political systems. Yeah, that's kind of it's kind of like a segregation structure thing. So instead of kind of changed by like individual persons. So I think you have a question. Does Qatari government see this as an issue?
I think the Qatari government sees the publicity around, or the public attention, the international public attention to labor violations as an issue, and has worked to address those violations that have received a lot of attention. But I don't think that there is a critical exploration of what skill means and how skill is applied. And for example, the segregation of the city by skill level is completely not viewed as controversial. And in part, you know, that's because it hasn't received much international attention. I think the notion, the politics of skill are so thin that even human rights organizations, for example, and other advocates for workers in Qatar don't look at the issue through that lens. And so it's just what is not publicized internationally is not addressed through policy.
Okay. Thank you. So I think we have all the questions, and also we already get to the time. So thank you.
Thank you.
Kevin have a question above. Let me see. Oh, sorry. So I think The question is, it strikes me that countries lack incentive to be credible regulators of migrant labor. Is that fair? Are international treaties being developed?
So it depends what you mean by credible regulators of migrant labor. I mean, Qatar does an amazing job in regulating its migrant labor. It knows exactly who is where and what their visa status is and how much they're getting paid and what occupations they're in. I mean, their Ministry of the Interior has really detailed as a thorough assessment of who's in the country and why. So if you're regulating migrant labor in that way, yeah, they're exceptional regulators. If you mean regulating the conditions of work for migrant workers, there are international treaties, and those are held by the ILO. But for the most part, right, those are not enforced. There are many countries that are parties to the treaties on forced labor, forced overtime, fair labor conditions, fair working conditions, and yet the enforcement depends on kind of government will, government action, and also kind of bureaucratic capacity. And that varies by country. I mean, Qatar in some ways is not more culpable than, for example, in the US, where we have many instances of forced labor, forced overtime, wage theft, all experienced by migrant workers, many of whom fear actually bringing those exploitative conditions to the authorities' attention because of their undocumented status. And the push in our country, in the US, is really to actually, at the moment, to augment that. Well, now maybe we have a little bit of a reprieve, but not really a significant one, but to augment that fear by merging the enforcement of labor violations of labor conditions with immigration control. So, you know, I think there are international treaties. What they mean depends on context, on government context, but also on kind of these bigger politics around skill, belonging, rights, freedom. Thank you. That's a great question.
Thank you. Okay, so usually we give applause to the speaker. Thank you so much for your great helpful answers to the questions, and also give this excellent presentation to help us understand the skill in skill categories in construction, engineering, other industries in Qatar and also beyond. So thank you so much. Yeah, well,
have a lovely afternoon.
You too. Thanks.